Who would have thought the quiet girl from a humble farm could strike terror into the hearts of the toughest bandits? What they didn't know was her legendary reputation as the deadliest gunslinger in the West, until they made the mistake of crossing her. Who would you bet on in a showdown? A group of young, brash outlaws with nothing to lose, or a frail 98-year-old man in a rocking chair? What if I told you this old man once faced enemies on battlefields most people couldn't even imagine? These outlaws thought they had the upper hand. Moments later, they learned the hard way just how wrong they were. The summer sun cast long shadows across the quiet streets of Stillwater Creek, a town where time seemed to have slowed to a crawl. The air was thick with the scent of wild sage and the faint rustle of wind through the dry grass. Outside the general store, a 98-year-old man sat in a creaky rocking chair, his frail frame wrapped in a well-worn flannel shirt. Most knew him simply as Old Joe, a relic of a bygone era who spent his days quietly observing life from his favorite perch. Joe's eyes, though dulled by age, still held a sharpness that hinted at stories untold. Few in town remembered that this quiet man had once been a soldier, a decorated veteran who had fought in the bloodiest theaters of World War II. He never spoke of those days, but the way he carried himself, even at his advanced age, left no doubt that he was someone to be reckoned with. The peace of the late afternoon was shattered by the distant rumble of motorcycles. A gang of outlaws, notorious for their exploits across the region, roared into town. Their leader, a cocky, leather-clad man with a sneer that could curdle milk, dismounted with a swagger that screamed trouble. Behind him, a ragtag group of menacing figures followed, their loud laughter and crude jokes disrupting the serenity of the moment. As they approached the store, their laughter died down, replaced by a predatory silence. Their eyes locked on Joe, the easy target they had decided to make an example of. One of them muttered, "This old geezer doesn't even look like he could stand up." Joe didn't flinch. He sat in his rocking chair, his hands folded over a walking cane that bore the marks of time. The men had no idea that beneath the frail exterior was a man who had seen and survived far worse than the likes of them. What happened next would not only turn the tide of their arrogance, but also remind the town and the outlaws that appearances can be deceiving. Stillwater Creek was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, and the arrival of the gang instantly set nerves on edge. The townsfolk, many of whom were inside the general store or tending to nearby businesses, peeked cautiously through curtains and behind half-open doors. Whispers of fear spread quickly. This was the notorious Red Vipers gang, a group infamous for robbery, intimidation, and worse. Joe remained seated, his gaze steady as the outlaws strutted closer. The leader, who went by the name Colt, Deadeye Harper, smirked as he leaned down to Joe's level. "Well, look at this, boys," Colt drawled, loud enough for everyone within earshot to hear. "The town's mascot. Tell me, Grandpa, you keep that cane for walking or for fighting off flies?" The gang erupted into laughter, slapping each other on the back. Joe, however, didn't so much as blink. He adjusted his grip on the cane and tilted his head slightly, as if appraising Colt and finding him unworthy of a response. His silence only seemed to embolden the outlaw. Colt reached out and snatched the hat off Joe's head, twirling it mockingly. "You hear me, old-timer? Or are you so far gone you've forgotten how to talk?" Joe's lips curled into the faintest smile, the kind that carried the weight of experience. When he finally spoke, his voice was gravelly but steady. "You know, son, in my day, men like you were a dime a dozen. Loud cocky thought they owned the world. You want to know where they ended up?" Colt narrowed his eyes, the laughter from his men fading as Joe's words landed heavier than expected. "Yeah," Colt sneered. "And where's that, Grandpa?" Joe's smile grew colder. "In the dirt?" The tension was palpable now. Even the wind seemed to still as the gang processed the unexpected defiance. Colt's smirk faltered for just a moment, but he quickly recovered, snorting in amusement. Tough talk for a man whose best days are behind him. Inside the general store, the shopkeeper, a middle-aged man named Harold, whispered frantically to his wife, "Someone needs to call the sheriff." But his wife shook her head. "Sheriff's out at the county line. By the time he gets here." Their words trailed off as the sound of a heavy thud interrupted their conversation. Outside, Colt had slammed his boot onto Joe's cane, snapping it in two. The gang cheered, the townsfolk gasped, and Joe finally rose from his chair. It was the way he stood that silenced the jeering. Despite his age, There was a deliberate, almost regal grace in his movements. He straightened to his full height, his back as straight as a rifle barrel. The broken cane clattered to the ground, but Joe's hands remained steady. "You shouldn't have done that," Joe said, his voice calm but carrying a weight that made even the boldest of the gang members shift uncomfortably. "Oh, is that right?" Colt said, his tone mocking but his confidence beginning to waver. "And why's that?" Joe didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object, his military dog tags. The metal glinted in the sunlight as he let them dangle from his fingers. "I earned these on battlefields you can't even pronounce. And let me tell you something, boy. I didn't come back from all that just to let some punk kid with a bad haircut disrespect me." The gang exchanged uneasy glances. The weight of Joe's words, combined with the sight of the dog tags, had started to crack their bravado. But Colt wasn't ready to back down. He gestured for one of his men to step forward. "Jake, show Grandpa here why he should have stayed in his rocking chair." Jake, a burly man with a scar running down the side of his face, grinned as he approached. "You heard the boss," he said, cracking his knuckles. "Time for your afternoon nap, old man." Joe didn't flinch. As Jake lunged, the veteran moved with surprising speed and precision. In one swift motion, he sidestepped the attack and landed a single, well-placed punch to Jake's gut. The impact sent the larger man staggering backward, clutching his stomach and gasping for air. The crowd watching from the shadows erupted into murmurs of disbelief. Joe, however, remained calm, shaking out his hand as if the punch had been nothing more than swatting a fly. "You've got about 10 seconds to pick your boy up and get out of town," Joe said, his voice carrying a quiet authority. "Or things are going to get real messy." Colt's confidence was now visibly shaken. He glanced at Jake, who was still doubled over on the ground, and then back at Joe, who hadn't even broken a sweat. The gang leader's pride wouldn't let him retreat just yet, but the unease in his eyes was unmistakable. The townsfolk, sensing a shift in power, began to step out of their hiding places. Harold, the shopkeeper, clenched his fists, emboldened by Joe's stand. For the first time in years, Stillwater Creek felt a glimmer of hope, a reminder that even the smallest towns can harbor giants. Colt Harper clenched his jaw, his eyes darting between Joe and his gang. The scene unfolding before him was nothing like what he had anticipated. This was supposed to be a quick show of dominance, a simple reminder to the townsfolk of Stillwater Creek, who held the reins. Instead, this old man, a relic by every visible standard, was unraveling his carefully curated intimidation act. Jake groaned, still on his knees. As one of the other gang members, a wiry man named Finn, helped him up. "What the hell just happened?" Jake muttered, wheezing with every breath. Finn shook his head, muttering back, "I don't know, but the boss ain't gonna let this slide." Colt squared his shoulders, a forced smirk creeping back onto his face. He reached down and plucked his revolver from its holster, twirling it idly on his finger. Well, he said, his voice dripping with mock admiration. "Seems Grandpa's got some fight left in him. But let's not forget who's really calling the shots here." The metallic gleam of Colt's weapon caught the sunlight, drawing gasps from the onlookers. Harold, still standing near the door of his store, reached instinctively for the phone to call the sheriff, but his wife grabbed his arm. "Not yet," she whispered. "Let's see what he does." Joe's gaze didn't waver as the barrel of Colt's gun pointed directly at him. "You think that scares me, boy?" he said, his voice low and steady. "I've stared down the business end of better guns than that, held by men twice your size and 10 times your courage." Colt's smirk faltered. He wasn't used to this. The people he confronted usually broke down in fear, scrambling to comply before things got worse. But Joe wasn't just standing firm. He was stripping away the layers of Colt's authority with every word. The veteran took a slow step forward, his boots crunching against the dusty ground. "Let me give you some advice, son," Joe continued. "You don't draw a weapon unless you're ready to use it. And you're not ready." For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Even the cicadas, whose constant drone was the soundtrack of Stillwater Creek, seemed to grow quieter. The tension was thick, the line between bluster and action razor-thin. Colt laughed, a sharp and humorless sound. "You're calling my bluff? That's bold, old-timer." He cocked the hammer on his revolver, the sound echoing ominously. "How about we see if you're really as tough as you act?" Joe didn't flinch. Instead, he reached into his pocket, the townsfolk gasping as one. But what he pulled out wasn't a weapon. It was an old weathered locket. He opened it slowly, revealing a faded photograph of a young woman and a baby. The sight made Colt pause, his finger hovering uncertainly over the trigger. "This," Joe said, holding the locket up for Colt to see, "is my wife and son. I carried this locket through every battle, every firefight, every hellhole I was thrown into. You think I'm scared of a punk with a shiny toy?" Finn nudged Colt's arm. "Boss," he murmured, his voice nervous. "Maybe we should—" "Shut up," Colt snapped, shaking him off. But his grip on the revolver was visibly less steady now, his confidence cracking under the weight of Joe's unwavering presence. Joe's voice softened, but it lost none of its power. "Go ahead, Colt. Pull the trigger. Show these people what kind of man you really are. Or," he added, his tone hardening, "you can holster that gun, gather your boys, and get out of my town." The crowd murmured, their fear beginning to transform into something else, something like hope. Even Harold and May, who had been so ready to call for help, felt a spark of courage reignite within him. He looked at his wife, who nodded silently, her eyes shining with resolve. Colt's men shifted uncomfortably, clearly unnerved by Joe's composure. Finn glanced at Jake, who still looked pale and shaken. "Boss," Finn tried again, his voice more insistent, "this ain't worth it." Colt glared at him, his frustration boiling over, but deep down, he knew Finn was right. This was supposed to be an easy job, a quick intimidation run. Now half the town was watching him falter, and the old man in front of him was an unyielding wall of defiance. Finally, Colt let out a low growl and uncocked the hammer on his revolver. "Fine," he spat, shoving the gun back into its holster. "You win, Grandpa, but don't think this is over." Joe nodded once, his expression unreadable. "Oh, I know it's not," he said quietly. "But the next time you come back, you'd better be ready for what you'll find." Colt's glare deepened, but he didn't reply. Instead, he gestured for his men to follow him. The gang mounted their horses, their departure marked by a cloud of dust and a trail of muttered curses. The townsfolk began to emerge from their hiding places, their faces a mixture of relief and awe. Harold approached Joe, his voice shaking. "Mr. Henshaw, I don't know how to thank you." Joe waved him off, his attention still on the fading silhouettes of the gang. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "They'll be back, and next time they won't hold back." As the dust settled from the Outlaws' departure, Stillwater Creek began to exhale, but the town's relief was short-lived as the faint thundering of hoofbeats echoed once more in the distance. Joe turned toward the horizon, his sharp eyes narrowing. "They're not gone far," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Harold froze mid-step. "You think they're coming back already?" Joe shook his head. "Not yet. That's not a retreat. It's a regroup." Colt doesn't strike me as the kind of man who takes humiliation lightly. The crowd, which had begun to gather around Joe, fell silent again. Eliza, the young schoolteacher, stepped forward. "Mr. Henshaw, if they come back, what do we do?" Joe straightened, his presence commanding yet calm. "We prepare," he said simply. "They'll come back with more men, and they'll come angrier. But anger makes men sloppy. If we're ready, we'll send them packing for good." The murmurs spread among the townsfolk, a blend of nervous energy and growing determination. For the first time in years, they felt the stirrings of resistance, a sense that they didn't have to bow to the outlaws who had terrorized their lives for so long. Joe turned to Harold. "How well are you stocked on supplies?" "Decent," Harold replied hesitantly. "Why?" "We're going to need a lot of nails, planks, and tools. It's time this town learned how to fortify itself." Eliza frowned. "Fortify? Mr. Henshaw? Are you saying we should fight them?" Joe gave her a measured look. "I'm saying we need to defend ourselves. Fighting is a last resort, but it's better to be prepared than to be caught unarmed. You don't win wars by hoping the enemy will go easy on you." As the crowd dispersed to gather materials, Joe found himself standing alone outside Harold's store. The sun was sinking low, casting long shadows across the dusty street. He pulled the locket from his pocket again, staring at the photograph within. The faces of his wife and son stared back at him, frozen in time, their expressions a bittersweet reminder of all he'd fought for and all he'd lost. Meanwhile, Colt and his men had made their way to a secluded clearing on the outskirts of town. The gang was larger now. The original four had been joined by a half-dozen others, their faces hardened and their weapons gleaming in the waning light. Among them stood a burly figure, with a scar cutting diagonally across his jaw. Harlan Bear Morrow, a notorious enforcer with a reputation for leaving no survivors. "You lost to an old man," Bear growled, his voice low and gravelly. His cold eyes bore into Colt, who shifted uncomfortably under the scrutiny. "I didn't lose," Colt snapped, though the words felt hollow. "The guy's a freak, calm as a corpse and fast as a rattler, but he's just one man. That town. Easy pickings once we send a message." Bear crossed his massive arms, unimpressed. "And what's your big plan, Colt? Walk in there and let him humiliate you again?" The gang leader clenched his fists, his pride stinging. "No," he hissed. "This time, we play it smart. We take out Henshaw first. Once he's gone, the rest will crumble like dust." Bear considered this, his expression unreadable. "Henshaw, huh? Name rings a bell. Old-timer with a military past." "Yeah," Colt replied, his tone biting. "Why?" "You know him." Bear let out a dry chuckle. "Not personally, but I've heard the stories. Guy was a sharpshooter in the Pacific. They say he could hit a bullseye at 100 yards without breaking a sweat." Colt's expression darkened. "I don't care who he was. He's just another has-been now, and I'll be damned if I let him make a fool out of me." Back in Stillwater Creek, the townsfolk worked late into the night under Joe's direction. Barricades were erected at key points along the main road. Windows were reinforced with wooden shutters, and makeshift alarms, strings of cans tied together, were set up to alert them to any approaching threats. Joe worked alongside them, his movements steady and purposeful despite his age. He showed them how to position the barricades for maximum defense and instructed the younger men on how to handle the few hunting rifles the town had at its disposal. By midnight, the town was quiet but vigilant. Eliza approached Joe as he stood guard near the town square. "Do you think they'll come tonight?" she asked softly. Joe shook his head. "No. Colt's mad, but he's not stupid. He'll wait until he thinks we're vulnerable." Eliza hesitated before speaking again. "Why are you doing this? You could have just walked away, left us to fend for ourselves." Joe's gaze didn't waver from the dark horizon. "Because I've seen what happens when good people do nothing. Fear only grows if you let it, and I've had enough of watching people suffer for the sake of cowards like Colt." Eliza nodded, her respect for the old veteran deepening. "Thank you," she said simply before returning to her post. Joe stood alone under the moonlight, his silhouette a quiet sentinel against the night. The wind whispered through the empty streets, carrying with it a sense of foreboding. He knew the battle was far from over, but for the first time in years, Stillwater Creek wasn't just surviving. It was fighting back. The morning sun rose over Stillwater Creek, its golden rays illuminating the makeshift fortifications scattered across the town. The barricades cast long shadows on the dusty streets, and the air buzzed with a mix of anticipation and unease. As the townsfolk awoke to a new day, the weight of what lay ahead was etched on every face. Joe Henshaw was already up, perched on a stool near the general store, cleaning an old revolver with the precision of someone who'd done it 1,000 times before. His hands were steady, his focus sharp, but his expression carried a quiet intensity. Nearby, Harold watched him, nervously clutching a shotgun that looked like it hadn't been fired in years. "You really think this'll work?" Harold asked, breaking the silence. Joe didn't look up. "It's not about whether it works perfectly. It's about showing them we're not an easy target. That changes the whole game." Harold nodded but didn't look convinced. He glanced at the small group of townsfolk gathering near the square. Men, women, even a few teenagers, all armed with whatever they could find, pitchforks, old rifles, even kitchen knives. Their fear was palpable, but so was their determination. Eliza approached Joe, her steps purposeful despite the apprehension in her eyes. "We've done what you asked. The barricades are up and everyone's been assigned a position. What now?" Joe slipped the revolver into its holster and stood, his tall frame casting a long shadow in the morning light. "Now, we wait. Colt won't attack head-on, not at first. He'll test us, look for weak spots. We hold our ground and don't give him any—" Eliza hesitated, then asked the question that had been gnawing at her. "Why do you think he's coming back? Wouldn't it be easier for him to just move on to another town?" Joe's green eyes met hers, steady and unflinching. "Because men like Colt live on power and fear. If he lets this town stand against him, his reputation crumbles. That's why he'll come. And that's why we can't let him win." A few miles outside of town, Colt and his gang were preparing for their assault. The clearing buzzed with activity as the men loaded their weapons, checked their horses, and exchanged grim glances. The addition of Bear Morrow to their ranks had bolstered their confidence, but even he couldn't hide his unease. Bear stood off to the side, watching Colt bark orders at the men. "You sure about this?" he asked, his voice low but firm. "Henshaw's no ordinary old man. If we're not careful, this could go sideways fast." Colt whirled around, his eyes blazing. "I don't need a lecture, Bear. We've got numbers, firepower, and surprise on our side. That old fool doesn't stand a chance." Bear raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Numbers don't mean squat if they're scared. You saw how fast those boys scattered yesterday. If you're not careful, you'll lose more than your pride." Colt stepped closer, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "I didn't bring you here to second-guess me. If you're not with us, you're against us. And I don't take kindly to traitors." Bear's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Instead, he turned and began loading his rifle, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't like the odds of this plan, but for now he had no choice but to play along. Back in Stillwater Creek, the mood was tense but resolute. Joe walked the perimeter, checking the barricades and offering quiet words of encouragement to the townsfolk. He paused near a group of teenagers, their faces pale but determined. "You all right?" he asked, his tone gentle but firm. A boy named Sam nodded, gripping a hunting rifle that looked almost too big for him. "We're ready, Mr. Henshaw." Joe studied him for a moment, then placed a hand on his shoulder. "Good. Just remember, don't let fear take over. You've got more strength than you know." Sam straightened, his grip on the rifle tightening. "Yes, sir." Joe moved on, his presence a steadying force in the charged atmosphere. He stopped by Eliza, who was busy organizing supplies near the schoolhouse. "You're doing good work," he said quietly. She looked up, surprised by the compliment. "Thank you. I just want to help." "You are," Joe replied, "more than you know." As the sun climbed higher, a distant sound broke the uneasy quiet, a low rumble, faint but unmistakable. The townsfolk froze, their eyes turning to the horizon. Joe stepped into the middle of the square, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. "They're coming," he said calmly. "Positions, everyone." The townsfolk scattered, each taking their place behind the barricades or in the shadows of nearby buildings. Joe remained where he was, his silhouette stark against the bright sky. He watched as the dust cloud on the horizon grew larger, the sound of hoofbeats growing louder with each passing second. Harold appeared at his side, shotgun in hand. "What's the plan?" Joe's eyes never left the approaching riders. "Stick to the plan, stay calm, aim true, and let them know they picked the wrong town." As the first riders crested the hill, the tension in Stillwater Creek reached a fever pitch. The outlaws spread out, their horses snorting and pawing at the ground as they surveyed the fortified town. Colt rode at the front, his eyes locking onto Joe's. Behind him, Bear and the rest of the gang waited, their weapons glinting in the sunlight. Joe stepped forward, his voice ringing out across the square. "You've had your fun, Colt. Turn around now and we'll forget this ever happened." Colt laughed, the sound sharp and bitter. "You really think you can scare us, old man? We own this town." Joe's hand rested on his revolver, his expression calm but unyielding. "Not anymore." As Colt and his men sat poised on the outskirts of town, the tense standoff was interrupted by a complication no one had anticipated. From the hills just west of Stillwater Creek, another figure on horseback emerged, moving deliberately toward the outlaw camp. The rider was a woman, her long coat trailing in the wind, her wide-brimmed hat casting a shadow over sharp features that immediately caught Colt's attention. "Who the hell is that?" Colt muttered, narrowing his eyes as the rider approached. Bear shifted uneasily, his hand instinctively resting on his rifle. "That's Nora Kane. Didn't think she'd be anywhere near here." Colt raised an eyebrow. "You know her. Everyone knows her," Bear replied grimly. "She's a bounty hunter. And if she's here, it's not for a friendly chat." Nora dismounted gracefully, her boots hitting the dirt with a solid thud. She scanned the camp with an appraising gaze before locking eyes with Colt. Her voice was calm, but the steel in her tone left no room for argument. "Colt Emerson," she said, her words cutting through the air like a blade. "I've been tracking you for months. Figured you'd show your face in a backwater like this." Colt smirked, but the tension in his posture betrayed him. "If you've got something to say, say it quick." "I'm busy," Nora crossed her arms, her fingers brushing the butt of the revolver holstered at her hip. Busy digging your own grave, from the looks of it. You really think you can take on this town and walk away unscathed? Henshaw's not the kind of man you cross and live to tell the tale, Bear muttered under his breath. She's not wrong. Colt shot him a glare before turning back to Nora. What's your angle, Kane? You here to collect your bounty, or are you just looking for trouble? Nora's lips curled into a faint smile. Both, maybe. But I'll tell you this. If you keep going down this path, you're going to end up dead, or in shackles. Your choice. Meanwhile, inside Stillwater Creek, a new issue was brewing. Eliza had been tasked with organizing supplies and managing the townsfolk, but a few dissenting voices began to rise above the crowd. A wiry man named Vernon, known for his fiery temper, stood in the middle of a small group, his voice loud and accusatory. "This is madness," he shouted. "We're putting our lives in the hands of an old man who thinks he's still in the war. We should just pack up and leave before those outlaws tear us apart." Eliza stepped forward, her voice firm but measured. "Leaving isn't an option, Vernon. If we run, they'll come after us, one by one. This is our home. We have to defend it." Vernon sneered. "Easy for you to say. You're not the one with a family to protect." Eliza's eyes flashed with anger, but before she could respond, Joe appeared, his presence immediately silencing the argument. He approached Vernon calmly, his gaze steady. "You're scared," Joe said plainly. "I don't blame you. Fear's natural, but running won't keep you safe. It'll just make you a target." Vernon hesitated, his bravado faltering under Joe's calm demeanor. "And what makes you so sure we can win?" Joe stepped closer, his voice low but firm. "Because I've been in worse spots than this and come out alive. Trust me or don't, that's your choice. But if you run, you're on your own." The weight of Joe's words hung in the air, and Vernon finally looked away, muttering under his breath as he shuffled back into the crowd. Eliza shot Joe a grateful look, but he merely nodded, his focus already shifting back to the impending fight. As the day wore on, the townsfolk fortified their positions, preparing for what felt like an inevitable storm. Joe called a meeting in the square, gathering everyone to go over the plan one last time. The atmosphere was heavy, but a sense of unity had begun to take root, driven by Joe's quiet confidence and unwavering determination. "We stick to the plan," Joe said, his voice carrying over the crowd. "Stay in your positions, don't waste ammunition. And remember, we're stronger together than they think." Eliza raised her hand, stepping forward. "And what if they try to flank us?" "The barricades don't cover the east side." Joe nodded, appreciating the question. "Good point. We'll station 2 lookouts there. Harold, you take Sam and cover that side. If you see anything, signal immediately." Harold nodded, gripping his shotgun tighter. Sam, standing next to him, straightened his shoulders, determined not to show fear. Outside the town, Colt was grappling with his own challenges. Nora Kane's presence had thrown a wrench into his plans, and her warnings echoed in his mind. As night began to fall, he gathered his men around the campfire, his voice sharp and commanding. "We move at dawn," he announced. "We hit them hard and fast. No mercy." Bear frowned. "What about Kane?" Colt's jaw tightened. "If she gets in the way, she'll regret it." Bear exchanged a glance with one of the other outlaws, his unease growing. The gang's usual bravado was cracking, and the seeds of doubt were beginning to take root. Back in Stillwater Creek, Joe stood on the porch of the general store, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Eliza joined him, her face lined with exhaustion, but lit by a spark of determination. "You think they'll come tonight?" she asked quietly. Joe shook his head. "No. They'll wait until morning, try to catch us off guard, but we'll be ready." Eliza nodded, her gaze fixed on the distant hills. "We have to be." The campfire at Stillwater Creek crackled softly as the townsfolk settled into their positions for the night. The air was thick with tension, every shadow stretching a little too long, every creak of wood sounding louder than it should. Eliza found herself pacing near the central barricade, her mind racing with questions and doubts. Joe noticed her restless movement and approached, his steady presence grounding in the eerie calm. "You've been pacing for 20 minutes, he said, leaning his rifle against a stack of crates. "What's on your mind?" Eliza stopped and sighed, looking at him with weary eyes. "I keep thinking about what Vernon said earlier. What if he's right? What if this is madness? These people are counting on us, And if we fail, Joe interrupted her gently. You can't let doubt control you. It's natural to question yourself, but fear and hesitation can kill you faster than a bullet. She frowned. You make it sound so simple. It's not simple, Joe admitted, his gaze distant as if recalling memories long buried. But I've learned that in moments like this, you focus on what you can control, use one step at a time. Eliza studied him for a moment, searching for the source of his unshakable confidence. How do you do it? Stay so calm. Joe chuckled softly. Calm. Trust me, I've just gotten good at hiding it. But here's the thing, people need to see strength even when you don't feel it. That's what keeps them steady. Eliza nodded slowly, taking in his words. For a moment, the weight on her chest seemed a little lighter. Meanwhile, outside the town, the outlaw camp was anything but calm. Colt's temper had flared repeatedly throughout the evening, his frustration boiling over as his carefully laid plans began to unravel. Nora Kane's warning had sown seeds of doubt among his men, and their usual bravado was faltering. Bear approached the fire where Colt sat brooding, his voice hesitant. Colt, maybe we should rethink this. Kane's not the kind to bluff, and this town, it's different. Something about that old man doesn't sit right. Colt glared at him, his voice sharp. You losing your nerve, you Bear. Bear held his ground, though his hands fidgeted with the brim of his hat. I'm just saying we've always been smart about this stuff. We pick our fights. This one feels off. Colt stood abruptly, towering over Bear. We've come too far to back down now. You think I'm going to let some washed-up veteran and a handful of farmers scare us off? Bear didn't respond, his silence speaking volumes. Around the camp, other outlaws exchanged uneasy glances, the cracks in their unity widening. As the night deepened, tension brewed in both camps. Joe made one last round through Stillwater Creek, checking on the barricades and reassuring the townsfolk. He stopped by the east side lookout where Harold and Sam were stationed. How's it looking? Joe asked quietly, peering into the darkness beyond the barricade. Harold shrugged. Quiet so far. Too quiet, maybe. Sam, younger and less experienced, shifted nervously. Do you think they'll really come? Or are they just trying to scare us? Joe looked at the young man, his expression unreadable. They'll come, and when they do, you'll be ready. Sam swallowed hard, but nodded. I won't let you down. Joe clapped him on the shoulder. I know you won't. Just remember you're not alone. Stick to the plan and we'll get through this. In the quiet moments before dawn, Joe found himself sitting on the porch of the general store, cleaning his revolver. The familiar routine calmed his nerves, each movement precise and methodical. Eliza joined him, carrying a steaming mug of coffee. Thought you could use this, she said, handing him the mug. Joe accepted it with a nod of thanks. Appreciate it. They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the distant chirping of crickets. Finally, Eliza spoke. You ever get tired of it? Fighting. Joe took a sip of coffee before answering. Every damn day. But sometimes you don't have a choice. You fight because if you don't, someone else pays the price. Eliza looked down at her hands, her voice barely above a whisper. I lost my brother in a fight like this. He thought he could save everyone, but he couldn't save himself. Joe set the coffee aside and turned to her, his expression serious. You can't save everyone, Eliza, no matter how hard you try. But if you can make a difference for even one person, it's worth it. She nodded, tears glistening in her eyes but refusing to fall. Thanks, Joe, for everything. Back at the outlaw camp, the tension reached a breaking point. Nora Kane, still watching from the shadows, decided to make her move. She approached Colt directly, her voice cutting through the uneasy murmurs of his men. You're making a mistake, Emerson, she said. That town isn't like the others you've hit. That old man you're underestimating, he's got more fight in him than you realize. Colt smirked, but it was forced. You seem awfully invested in this town, Kane. Why's that? Nora's gaze hardened. Because I've seen what happens when people like you think they can take whatever they want, and I'm tired of cleaning up the mess. Colt's smirk faded, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. For the first time, he wondered if he was truly in over his head. The first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, painting Stillwater Creek in hues of gold and pink. The calm belied the storm brewing in the shadows, a tension so palpable it seemed to hang in the air like the mist over the fields. Joe Hayes stood atop the town's central lookout point, binoculars in hand, scanning the distant tree line. The faint sound of birds chirping offered a fleeting sense of normalcy, but his seasoned instincts told him the calm wouldn't last. Below, Eliza rallied a group of townsfolk near the barricades. They had spent the night fortifying their defenses with anything they could find: wooden carts, barrels, even an old wagon wheel. Their fear was evident, but so was their determination. "Remember," Eliza said, her voice firm, "stick to your positions. Don't fire unless you have a clear shot, and whatever happens, trust Joe's plan." Meanwhile, in the outlaw camp, the atmosphere was entirely different. Colt paced around the dying embers of their campfire, his face a mask of frustration. His crew was restless, the once tight camaraderie fraying at the edges. "Why are we waiting?" Bear muttered under his breath, his voice carrying just enough to reach Colt's ears. Colt spun around, his gaze sharp. "Because we do this right. No mistakes, no surprises." Bear scoffed but didn't argue further. He glanced toward the tree line, where Nora Kane leaned against a tree, her expression unreadable. The woman's presence unnerved him, her cryptic warnings playing on his mind. "Maybe she's right," Bear muttered to Switchblade, who was cleaning his knife nearby. "Maybe we're walking into something we don't understand." Switchblade shrugged, his usual bravado tempered by the growing unease. "Colt's got a plan. We stick to it." But Bear wasn't convinced. Something about Stillwater Creek felt different, and he couldn't shake the feeling that they were outmatched in ways they couldn't see. Back in town, Joe gathered his core group, Eliza, Harold, Sam, and a few others, for a final briefing. The mood was tense but resolute. "They'll come soon," Joe said, pointing to a map spread out on the table. "And when they do, they'll likely try to split our focus. We hold the line here and here," he indicated the two main barricades, "and we keep a few sharpshooters on the rooftops to pick off anyone who gets too close." Harold frowned. "What if they try to flank us?" Joe nodded. "They will. That's why we've set up the traps along the north path. Anyone who tries to sneak through there will regret it." Eliza looked at him, her brow furrowed. "And what about you? Where will you be?" Joe's green eyes met hers, a flicker of determination in his gaze. "Where I'm needed." As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the town, the sound of distant hoofbeats broke the fragile silence. The townsfolk tensed, their eyes darting toward the source of the noise. Joe climbed back to the lookout, his heart steady despite the growing tension. Through his binoculars, he saw them, a line of riders emerging from the tree line, their dark silhouettes backlit by the morning sun. At their head was Colt Emerson, his posture radiating arrogance, his hat tilted low over his eyes. "They're coming!" Joe called down to the others. "Positions!" The town sprang into action. Men and women took their places behind the barricades, rifles and shotguns at the ready. The sharpshooters on the rooftops steadied their aim, their breath slow and deliberate. From her position near the general store, Eliza scanned the faces of the townsfolk around her. They were scared, but they were ready. She gripped her revolver tightly, her knuckles white. The outlaws stopped just outside rifle range, their horses snorting and pawing at the dirt. Colt dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate, calculated. He removed his hat and wiped his brow, his gaze sweeping over the town. "Stillwater Creek," he called out, his voice carrying over the distance. "We don't want no trouble. Just give us what we came for, and we'll be on our way." Joe's voice rang out in response, firm and unwavering. "You're not getting a damn thing, Emerson. Turn around while you still can," Colt smirked, amused by the defiance. "You think a bunch of farmers and shopkeepers can stop us? You've got guts, old man. I'll give you that." Joe stepped into view, his rifle resting casually on his shoulder. "I've faced worse than you, Colt. You and your boys picked the wrong town." For a moment, the two men locked eyes, a silent battle of wills playing out between them. Around Colt, his men shifted uneasily, the weight of Joe's presence unsettling them in ways they couldn't quite articulate. Back in the shadows, Nora Kane watched the exchange with keen interest. She had warned Colt, but she knew men like him rarely listened. Now, as she observed the tension escalate, a flicker of doubt crossed her mind. Had she done enough to prevent the inevitable? Bear sidled up to her, his expression conflicted. "This feels wrong, Nora. You feel it too." Nora's gaze remained fixed on Joe. "It's not just a feeling, Bear. It's the truth. And you'll see it soon enough." As the standoff continued, A single gunshot shattered the silence, the sound reverberating through the valley. No one knew who fired the first shot, but it didn't matter. Chaos erupted. Joe barked orders, his voice cutting through the din. "Hold your ground, remember the plan." The townsfolk responded with disciplined precision, their resolve holding firm even as the outlaws charged. From the rooftops, the sharpshooters picked off riders with deadly accuracy, their bullets finding their marks. Eliza fired her revolver, her shots clean and precise. She moved with purpose, her nerves steady despite the chaos around her. The once serene streets of Stillwater Creek now echoed with the cacophony of gunfire, shouts, and the clatter of hooves. Smoke curled from the barrels of rifles, mixing with the dust kicked up by frantic movements. The air was thick with tension, every second feeling like an eternity. From her position behind a stack of crates near the general store, Eliza could hear the strained breathing of Sam beside her. He was young, barely out of his teens, and his trembling hands gripped the shotgun like a lifeline. "You're doing fine," Eliza said, her voice calm and steady despite the chaos. "Just keep your eyes on the alley. If anyone comes through, you aim and fire. Don't hesitate." Sam nodded, swallowing hard. I'm trying." Eliza placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You've got this. Remember, you're not alone." The brief exchange gave Sam the courage to steady his aim, his resolve hardening as he glanced at Eliza's unwavering focus. She had become a symbol of resilience for the townsfolk, her determination infectious. Meanwhile, on the rooftops, Harold and another sharpshooter, Lydia, worked in tandem. Their vantage point gave them a clear view of the advancing outlaws, and their shots rang out with lethal precision. Harold pulled back from the scope of his rifle and glanced at Lydia. "You're a damn good shot, you know that." Lydia smirked, her eyes scanning for her next target. "You'd be too if you grew up hunting coyotes in the plains. Now focus, two coming in from the left." Harold adjusted his aim and fired, dropping an outlaw who had tried to sneak through the side alley. "Got him." Nice spot. The camaraderie between the two helped ease the tension of the moment, their teamwork proving crucial in holding the line. At the main barricade, Joe stood like a sentinel, his rifle barking with precise, measured shots. He had positioned himself strategically. Knowing his presence alone was enough to inspire confidence in the defenders. Bear, one of Colt's men, was crouched behind a fallen tree just outside the barricade. He exchanged a worried glance with another outlaw, the weight of doubt pressing heavily on his shoulders. "This ain't what we signed up for," Bear muttered, reloading his weapon. "They're too organized." His companion, Switchblade, sneered, "Quit whining and keep shooting. Colt's got this." But even as he spoke, Switchblade's voice lacked its usual bravado. The sight of their comrades falling one by one had shaken even the most hardened among them. Back at the heart of the town, Nora Kane moved through the chaos like a ghost, her keen eyes assessing every detail. She had warned Colt about Joe Hayes, but now that the fight was underway, she realized her warnings hadn't been enough. Spotting Colt near the stables, she approached him, her voice sharp. "You need to pull back, Emerson. This isn't going the way you planned." Colt turned to her, his face twisted with frustration. "We're not running, Kane. I don't care what it takes. We're finishing this." "Finishing what?" Nora shot back. "Getting yourself and your men killed. Open your eyes, Colt. You've already lost." Colt's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Deep down, he knew she was right. The battle had turned against them, and the longer they stayed, the worse it would get. As the fight raged on, the townsfolk began to push back the outlaws, their determination unyielding. Every inch of ground gained was hard fought, but the tide was unmistakably turning. Joe's keen eyes spotted an opportunity as the outlaws began to falter. He called out to Eliza, who had taken up position near the barricade. "Eliza, take a group and cut them off at the western alley. If we can block their escape, we'll have them pinned." Eliza nodded and rallied a small group of defenders. Among them was Sam, who had found his courage in the heat of battle. "Let's move," she shouted, leading the way with her revolver at the ready. The western alley was narrow and cluttered with barrels and debris, creating a natural choke point. Eliza and her group moved swiftly, taking up positions that gave them a clear advantage. As the first outlaws stumbled into the alley, they were met with a hail of gunfire. Eliza's aim was deadly, each shot finding its mark. Sam, despite his earlier fear, held his ground and fired with surprising accuracy. The ambush was devastating, and the outlaws who survived quickly retreated, their morale shattered. By now, the remaining outlaws were in full retreat, their once mighty force reduced to a scattering of desperate men. Colt, seeing the writing on the wall, mounted his horse and shouted orders to what was left of his crew. Fall back to the ridge." Nora watched him ride off, a mixture of relief and disappointment washing over her. She had hoped Colt might see reason, but his pride had proven too great. As the dust settled, the townsfolk emerged from their positions, their faces etched with exhaustion but also a newfound sense of pride. They had stood their ground against overwhelming odds and emerged victorious. Joe surveyed the scene, his expression unreadable. He knew the fight wasn't over yet. Colt would regroup and they would have to be ready. But for now, Stillwater Creek had won its first battle. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across Stillwater Creek, the town prepared for what they knew would be the final showdown. The outlaws had retreated for now, but Joe Hayes and the townsfolk were under no illusions. Colt Emerson was not a man to accept defeat without one last desperate gamble. The quiet that followed the battle was almost eerie. In the aftermath, the wounded were tended to, barricades were reinforced, and ammunition was counted with grim efficiency. Eliza wiped the sweat and soot from her brow as she helped patch up a grazed shoulder for Sam. "You did good out there," she said, her voice steady. "You held your ground." Sam managed a shaky smile. "Didn't feel good. Thought I was going to drop the shotgun more than once." "But you didn't," Eliza replied firmly, "and that's what matters." Joe stood at the edge of the ridge overlooking the surrounding terrain. He could see dust clouds in the distance, Colt's men regrouping at their makeshift camp. They'd be back, and likely with reinforcements. Harold joined him, leaning on his rifle. "They won't give up easy," he said, following Joe's gaze. "No," Joe agreed, his voice heavy. "Colt's pride won't let him walk away. He's already lost too much face. He'll be back with everything he's got." Harold frowned. "And we'll be ready." Joe turned to him, his expression grim but resolute. "We have to be. This next fight, it'll be the one that decides everything." At the outlaws' camp, tension simmered. Colt paced near the fire, his temper barely contained. Nora Kane sat off to the side, sharpening a blade with deliberate strokes, her silence more telling than any words. "You all saw what happened today," Colt barked, addressing his men. "They got lucky, that's all. But we're not going to let a bunch of farmers and has-beens humiliate us. We hit them hard tomorrow and we finish this." Bear, still nursing a wound from earlier, spoke up hesitantly. "Boss, maybe we should cut our losses." "That town's not worth it." Colt whirled on him, his face a mask of fury. "Not worth it? They made fools of us. If we walk away now, every two-bit town in the county will think they can stand up to us. No, we're going back. And we're going to remind them who we are." Nora finally spoke, her voice low but sharp. "You're thinking with your pride, Emerson. That's how men get killed." Colt glared at her but said nothing. The firelight flickered between them, casting long shadows that danced like specters of the conflict to come. Back in town, Eliza and Joe convened with the rest of the defenders. The air was thick with determination, the exhaustion of the earlier fight overshadowed by the resolve to protect their home. "We know they'll come back," Joe began, his deep voice cutting through the murmurs. "And we know they'll bring more men. But we also know this town, every street, every building, every hiding spot. That's our advantage. We use it." Eliza stepped forward, her presence commanding attention. "We've shown them we're not afraid. That gives us power, but it also means they'll come at us with everything they've got. We need to stay sharp and stick together. No one fights alone." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. The townsfolk, many of whom had never fired a gun before today, now stood as a united force. As night fell, the town settled into an uneasy quiet. Harold and Lydia took shifts on the rooftops, their keen eyes scanning the dark horizon. Joe sat alone in the sheriff's office, cleaning his rifle with methodical precision. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on his shoulders. Eliza found him there, her own weapon slung over her shoulder. "Can't sleep?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Joe didn't look up. "Too much on my mind." She pulled up a chair and sat across from him. "You've done everything you can, we all have." Joe met her gaze, his expression softening slightly. "I just don't want anyone else getting hurt." "We're in this together," Eliza said firmly. "You taught us how to fight. Now you need to trust us to hold the line." Joe nodded, the faintest hint of a smile crossing his face. "You're a lot like your mother, you know that. Stubborn and fearless." Eliza's eyes glistened, but she managed a small laugh. "Guess it runs in the family." As dawn approached, the tension in the town became palpable. The defenders took their positions, each one ready to face whatever Colt and his men would bring. The barricades were reinforced, weapons loaded, and hearts steeled for the battle ahead. In the stillness before the sun broke over the horizon, Joe addressed the townsfolk one last time. "We've fought hard to protect this place," he said, his voice carrying over the gathered crowd. "We've shown them we won't back down. Now we finish what we started. Whatever happens today, know this. You've already won by standing together." The first rays of sunlight spilled over the rooftops, illuminating the determined faces of the townsfolk. In the distance, the sound of hooves and wagon wheels signaled the arrival of the outlaws. The final confrontation was at hand. The first rays of sunlight crept across the horizon, casting an orange glow over Stillwater Creek. The air was heavy with the tension of a town bracing for its final stand. From the makeshift barricades, Joe Hayes watched the distant dust cloud rising against the dawn sky, signaling the approach of Colt Emerson and his gang. Joe's sharp eyes counted at least 20 riders, more than double the number that had attacked the town the previous day. They had brought wagons, likely carrying extra firepower. This wasn't just a raid, it was a calculated assault meant to crush all resistance. "They're coming," Harold called from his perch atop the general store. The townsfolk readied themselves. Eliza tightened the straps on her holster, her revolver resting steady at her side. Beside her, Sam fidgeted nervously with his shotgun, earning a reassuring pat on the shoulder from Lydia. "We've faced them before," Lydia said. "We can face them again." Eliza gave Sam a determined nod. "Stick to the plan and we'll get through this." Colt Emerson rode at the front of his gang, his presence commanding as always. Beside him, Nora Kane's cold eyes scanned the town, taking in the barricades and strategically placed defenders. She spotted Joe Hayes standing tall near the center of the line, his rifle resting against his shoulder. Colt sneered. "There he is, the old man who thinks he can defy us." Nora said nothing, but her grip on the reins tightened. The tension between her and Colt had only grown since the previous day's defeat, but now was not the time to air grievances. She had her own calculations to make. As they approached, Colt called out, his voice booming over the quiet town. "Stillwater Creek, this is your last chance. Lay down your arms and we might just let you walk away." Joe stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "We've made our choice, Emerson." "This town doesn't bow to bullies," Colt chuckled darkly. "Suit yourself." He raised his hand, signaling his men to fan out. The gang spread across the street, their weapons glinting in the early morning light. The outlaws looked confident, but beneath the bravado there was unease. The events of the previous day had shaken them, and the sight of the armed townsfolk standing resolute only added to their tension. The silence stretched, broken only by the soft whinny of a horse and the creak of wagon wheels. Then, without warning, the first shot rang out. A bullet struck the wooden beam of a storefront, sending splinters flying. The defenders fired back, and chaos erupted. Gunfire filled the air as the outlaws charged, their horses thundering down the main street. Joe barked orders, his voice cutting through the noise. "Hold your positions, don't waste your shots." Eliza ducked behind a barrel, firing at an approaching rider. Her aim was true, and the outlaw tumbled from his saddle. Beside her, Lydia worked the lever on her rifle with practiced precision, picking off another rider before they could reach the barricade. Harold, perched above the fray, provided cover fire, his steady aim keeping the outlaws from gaining too much ground. But the gang was relentless, their numbers pressing hard against the defenders. Colt directed his men from the rear, shouting commands and urging them forward. He had underestimated the townsfolk once, and he was determined not to make the same mistake twice. "Take out the old man," he yelled, pointing toward Joe. "Without him, they'll fall apart." Several outlaws broke off from the main group, focusing their fire on Joe's position. He ducked behind a wagon, returning fire with deadly accuracy. One by one, the attackers fell, but Joe knew he couldn't hold out forever. Seeing her father under siege, Eliza made a decision. She darted from her position, weaving through the chaos to reach Joe's side. Sliding into cover beside him, she handed him extra ammunition. "You didn't have to come here," Joe said, a hint of worry in his voice. "Yes, I did," Eliza replied, her tone unwavering. "We're in this together." Meanwhile, Nora Kane watched the battle unfold from the sidelines. She had no love for Colt Emerson or his brutish tactics. The sight of the townsfolk fighting so fiercely stirred something in her, memories of a time when she had fought for something more noble than greed. As Colt barked another order, Nora made her move. She turned her horse sharply, riding toward the town instead of away. Drawing her revolver, she aimed at one of Colt's men who had managed to breach the barricade and was targeting a young boy armed with a slingshot. The shot rang out, and the outlaw fell, saving the boy's life. The townsfolk, startled by the unexpected aid, hesitated for a moment before realizing what had happened. Joe caught sight of Nora and understood immediately. "She's on our side," he called out. "Cover her." The tide began to turn. Nora's defection threw the outlaws into disarray, and the defenders capitalized on the moment. Lydia and Harold coordinated their fire, targeting the wagons carrying extra ammunition and supplies. Explosions rocked the street as the wagons ignited, scattering the remaining outlaws. Colt, seeing his carefully laid plans crumble, snarled in frustration. He spurred his horse toward Joe, determined to end the fight himself. With a pistol in each hand, he charged, his eyes blazing with fury. Joe stepped into the open, his rifle raised. The two men locked eyes, the culmination of their conflict about to unfold. The dust swirled in the early morning air as Colt Emerson charged forward, his horse kicking up a cloud of grit and sand. His pistols gleamed in the sunlight, each one trained on Joe Hayes, the man who had defied him at every turn. The street was a battlefield, littered with the aftermath of the intense fight. The cries of wounded outlaws and the groans of battered townsfolk echoed across the scene. Joe stood his ground in the center of the street, his weathered face calm and steady despite the chaos around him. His rifle was leveled, the barrel unwavering as he tracked Colt's movements. The years had taken their toll on his body, but not on his resolve. This moment was decades in the making. A lifetime of battles, loss, and resilience had prepared him for this final showdown. Eliza crouched behind the barricade, her heart pounding as she watched her father face off against the infamous outlaw leader. Every instinct told her to rush to his side, but she knew better. Joe Hayes wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for her, for the town, and for everyone who had suffered under Colt's tyranny. "Stay steady," she whispered to herself, clutching her revolver tightly. She had to trust him. Colt fired first, the crack of his pistols cutting through the air. The bullets whizzed past Joe, missing by mere inches as he sidestepped with surprising agility. Joe returned fire, the sharp report of his rifle echoing down the street. His shot struck Colt's pistol hand, forcing the outlaw to drop one of his weapons with a curse. "Still think you can run this town?" Joe called out, his voice carrying a hard edge. "Your reign ends here," Colt snarled, switching his remaining pistol to his uninjured hand. "You're just an old man past his prime. I've taken down better than you." As Colt dismounted, his movements slowed by the injury, the townsfolk seized the opportunity to press their advantage. Harold provided covering fire from the rooftop, taking down two more outlaws who attempted to regroup. Lydia and Sam flanked the remaining gang members, forcing them to retreat further into disarray. The once intimidating gang was unraveling before their eyes. Nora Kane emerged from the shadows, her pistol drawn and her aim steady. She fired a warning shot at one of Colt's men who was trying to draw a bead on Joe. The outlaw froze, his hands raised in surrender. "This fight's over," she said firmly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen enough bloodshed to last a lifetime. Joe and Colt circled each other in the middle of the street, the tension between them palpable. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows that danced across the dusty ground. Each man studied the other, looking for an opening. "You think you're a hero?" Colt taunted, his voice dripping with contempt. "You're just a relic of a time no one cares about anymore." Joe's lips curled into a wry smile. "Funny, coming from a man whose whole life is built on fear and violence, you've got no idea what real strength looks like." Colt lunged forward, raising his pistol. Joe sidestepped again, his movements deceptively quick. With precision born of years of training, he swung the butt of his rifle, knocking Colt's weapon from his hand. The pistol clattered to the ground, and Colt stumbled, momentarily disoriented. Eliza couldn't take it anymore. She rose from her position, her revolver aimed squarely at Colt. "Step away from him," she shouted. her voice trembling with a mix of anger and determination. Colt turned, his cold eyes locking onto hers. He sneered, but before he could utter a word, Nora stepped into view, her own weapon trained on him. "You've lost, Colt," Nora said. "Walk away while you still can." The remaining outlaws saw the shift in power and began to lower their weapons. One by one, they dropped their guns, raising their hands in surrender. The townsfolk, emboldened by the turn of events, moved in to secure the prisoners. Harold climbed down from the rooftop, joining Lydia and Sam as they rounded up the defeated gang members. Colty, however, wasn't ready to give up. He lunged at Joe, his fist swinging in a wild arc. Joe caught the blow with his forearm, countering with a swift strike to Colt's jaw. The outlaw leader fell to the ground, dazed but not unconscious. "You're done," Joe said, standing over him. His voice was low but filled with finality. "This town isn't yours to take." The sound of hooves signaled the arrival of the sheriff and a posse from the neighboring town. They had heard the commotion and ridden hard to lend their support. The sheriff dismounted, his expression grim as he took in the scene. "Looks like you've been busy, Joe," the sheriff said, tipping his hat. "We'll take it from here." Joe nodded, stepping back as the sheriff and his men secured Colt and the remaining outlaws. The townsfolk gathered around, their faces reflecting a mixture of relief and awe. They had stood their ground and won, but they knew it wouldn't have been possible without Joe Hayes. As the last of the outlaws were led away, the sun reached its peak, bathing the town in golden light. Stillwater Creek had been changed forever. The people had found their courage, and the man who had inspired them stood quietly among them, his work done, for now. The dust settled slowly on Stillwater Creek, revealing the aftermath of the battle. The main street, once a scene of chaos and violence, now stood eerily quiet. The townsfolk began to gather in clusters, their faces etched with a mixture of relief and exhaustion, but all eyes remained on the man at the center of it all, Joe Hayes. Joe's breathing was steady despite the ordeal, his rifle hanging loosely in his grip. The sunlight glinted off the barrel, casting faint reflections on the ground. Around him, the bodies of defeated outlaws and scattered weapons painted a stark reminder of the fight that had just transpired. And at his feet, Colt Emerson knelt, bound by the sheriff's deputies, his arrogance stripped away. "Is it over?" Eliza's voice cut through the heavy silence, her revolver still clutched tightly in her hand. She stepped cautiously toward her father, her boots crunching against the dirt and debris. Joe turned to her, his weathered face softening for the first time in hours. "For now," he replied, his voice calm but laden with the weight of the moment. He reached out, resting a steady hand on her shoulder. "You did good, kid." Eliza allowed herself a faint smile, though her eyes remained sharp, scanning for any lingering threats. "You too, old man." The sheriff, a tall man with a grizzled beard, approached with a respectful nod. "Joe, I've seen a lot in my years, but what you pulled off here today, it's something else. This town owes you." Joe shook his head. "They don't owe me a thing. They stood up for themselves. That's what matters." The sheriff looked around at the gathered townsfolk, many of whom were now tending to the wounded or helping clean up the street. "Still," he said, "it takes someone like you to show people what they're capable of." Joe didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked toward the horizon, where the sun was beginning its slow descent. "This town's been through enough," he said finally. "Let's make sure it stays safe." Meanwhile, Nora Kane stood a few steps away, watching the scene unfold. Her pistol hung at her side, the weight of her choices evident in her expression. She had turned against Colt Emerson, risking her life in the process. And now she stood at a crossroads. Joe approached her, his steps deliberate but unthreatening. "You made the right call, Nora," he said. She met his gaze, her eyes searching his for judgment. "I just got tired of living a lie," she admitted. "Tired of being part of something I didn't believe in." Joe nodded, understanding the unspoken pain behind her words. "Everyone deserves a second chance," he said. "What you do with it, that's up to you." Nora hesitated, then extended her hand. "Thank you," she said simply. Joe shook her hand, his grip firm but kind. "Good luck, Nora, wherever you end up." As the sheriff's deputies loaded the remaining outlaws into a wagon, Colt Emerson turned his head, his voice laced with venom. "This ain't over, Hayes. You think you've won, but you've only delayed the inevitable." Joe stepped closer, his shadow falling over Colt like a tangible force. "You're done, Emerson," he said, his tone unyielding. "The people here won't live in fear anymore. And if you ever come back, you won't walk away." For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed Colt's face. He looked away, defeated. The townsfolk began to gather around Joe, their voices filled with gratitude and admiration. Sarah Miller, the schoolteacher, approached with tears in her eyes. "Thank you, Joe," she said, her voice trembling. "You've given us our town back." Joe offered her a small smile. "It's your town, Sarah. Keep it that way." Harold, still nursing a minor wound on his arm, clapped Joe on the back. "We'll never forget what you've done here," he said. "You're a hero, whether you like it or not." Joe chuckled softly. "I'm just a man trying to do right." As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, the town began to settle into an uneasy peace. The barricades were taken down, the wounded were tended to, and the bodies of the fallen were laid to rest. But something intangible had shifted, a newfound strength and unity among the people of Stillwater Creek. Joe stood at the edge of the town, watching the horizon. Eliza joined him, her gaze following his. "What now?" she asked. Joe didn't answer immediately. After a long pause, he said, "We rebuild, we move forward, and we keep watch." Eliza nodded, her determination matching her father's. "Together, always," Joe said, placing an arm around her shoulders. The final rays of sunlight bathed the town in a warm glow as a gentle breeze rustled the trees. Stillwater Creek had been tested, and though scars remained, its spirit had endured. The people had faced their fears and emerged stronger, thanks in no small part to the quiet strength of a 98-year-old veteran who refused to back down. Joe Hayes turned to walk back into town, his daughter at his side, and the townsfolk cheering his name. The legend of what had happened that day would echo for generations, a reminder that courage and resilience could triumph over even the darkest of threats. The town of Stillwater Creek had never known a day like this. By the time the final rays of sunlight disappeared beyond the rolling hills, the scars of the morning's confrontation were already becoming part of the town's history. In the quiet that followed, the people began to understand the weight of what they had achieved and what they had overcome. Joe Hayes stood outside the sheriff's office, leaning against a weathered wooden post. The weight of the day hung on his shoulders, but his expression was calm. He watched as the sheriff and his deputies rode out, their wagon loaded with the defeated outlaws, including Colt Emerson. Their departure marked the end of one chapter and the start of another for Stillwater Creek. Eliza approached him, her face tired but determined. "You know," she said, her voice softer now, "you don't have to carry all this alone. The town knows what you've done and they won't forget it." Joe smiled faintly, his eyes softening as he looked at his daughter. "I don't do it for them to remember, Eliza. I do it because it's the right thing to do." The townsfolk had begun to gather again in the center of town, not out of fear this time, but to celebrate their resilience. Harold stood by Sarah Miller, both of them holding steaming mugs of coffee as they recounted the day's events to anyone who would listen. "That man," Harold said, pointing toward Joe, "he's the reason we're standing here now." Sarah nodded in agreement, her eyes glistening. "He reminded us that we're stronger than we think, that we can stand up for what's right." Nora Kane, still adjusting to her new role as an ally rather than an adversary, stayed on the outskirts of the gathering. She watched as the people laughed, shared stories, and expressed their gratitude to one another. She felt a pang of something unfamiliar. Hope. For the first time in years, she began to believe she could be part of something better. Later, as the moon rose high over the quiet town, Joe and Eliza returned to their small farmhouse on the outskirts of Stillwater Creek. The smell of freshly baked bread wafted from the kitchen, a comforting reminder of simpler times. Joe sat down at the worn wooden table, his body aching but his mind at ease. Eliza placed a cup of tea in front of him before sitting down across from him. They shared a long silence, the kind that needed no words. "You know," Eliza said finally, "this town might be safe for now, but there are others out there, places where people are still living in fear, where they don't have someone like you." Joe looked up at her, his gaze steady. "I've done my part, Eliza. This fight, it's for others to carry on now." "But they need someone to show them how," she pressed, her voice filled with quiet conviction. "Someone who can remind them of what they're capable of." Joe leaned back in his chair, considering her words. His hands, calloused and scarred from a lifetime of battles, rested on the table. He thought of all the towns like Stillwater Creek, places where people needed to see that courage wasn't limited by age or circumstance. "Maybe," he said at last, his voice thoughtful, "but this time I won't be doing it alone." Eliza smiled, her eyes shining with pride. "Good," she said, "because you're not getting rid of me that easily." As the days turned into weeks, the story of Stillwater Creek spread far beyond its borders. Travelers passing through spoke of the legendary confrontation, of the 98-year-old veteran who stood his ground against the infamous Colt Emerson. The tale became part of local folklore, a story told around campfires and in saloons, a reminder that true strength comes from within. Nora Kane chose to stay in town, working alongside the sheriff to rebuild trust and help others find their footing. She found a sense of purpose she had long thought lost, inspired by the example Joe Hayes had set. The people of Stillwater Creek, once subdued by fear, began to rebuild their lives with newfound confidence. The scars of the past remained, but they no longer defined the town. Instead, the people chose to focus on the future, on the legacy of resilience and courage that Joe Hayes had left behind. One evening, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, Joe sat on the porch of the farmhouse, his rifle leaning against the railing. Eliza joined him, carrying 2 cups of coffee. They sat in companionable silence, watching as the sky turned shades of pink and gold. "You ever regret coming back here?" Eliza asked after a while. Joe shook his head. "Not for a second," he said. "This place, these people, they're worth fighting for." Eliza nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "And if trouble comes knocking again," Joe chuckled softly, his green eyes twinkling, "then they'll know where to find me." The farmhouse fell quiet as the stars began to dot the night sky. The world seemed at peace, at least for now, and in the heart of Stillwater Creek, the spirit of Joe Hayes, the quiet, unyielding strength of a man who refused to back down, lived on. If this story of resilience and courage moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more tales of bravery and heart. Hit the notification bell so you won't miss our next video, another incredible story that will keep you on the edge of your seat. And if you enjoyed this, check out the video we've picked just for you. It's waiting for you on the screen now. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.